The stones of the palace walls were carved with victories, but they whispered of a defeat. They spoke of a woman who wore a crown, yet lived like a ghost. She was a queen who walked through halls paved with gold, her presence so utterly forgotten that even the servants sometimes forgot to bow. She was not a prisoner locked in a tower. She was worse. She was the wife of the most powerful man in Europe, and for 40 years, she was a silence in his song. The silk of the wedding gown felt stiff and suffocating, less like a dress of celebration and more like a beautifully woven cage. Elisabeth Christine, Princess of Brunswick-Bevern, had been raised on stories of power and glory. She was taught that marriage to a crown prince, especially one as intellectually sharp and famously promising as Frederick of Prussia, was not just a duty, it was the start of a legend. She stood, trembling slightly, waiting for the fanfare to announce her as his wife. Outside the massive church doors, the crowd roared. They were cheering for Frederick, the future of their nation, the man who would one day be known as Frederick the Great. Elisabeth told herself they were also cheering for her, for the queen who would stand beside him, the woman who would share in that greatness. The prince, however, did not look at her with the fire of a newly married man, nor even with the gentle regard of a friend. His eyes, famously pale and sharp, held a distant, cold light. They swept over her face and then immediately looked past her, fixing on something far away, perhaps a campaign map, a philosophical treatise, or a musical score. Anything, it seemed, but her. The forced wedding in 1733 was less a union of hearts and more a treaty signed in silk and gold. Frederick was forced into this political match by his powerful, dominating father. Elisabeth knew this. She understood the world of royal obligation. But deep inside, the young woman still held a tender, foolish hope that her genuine kindness, her quiet intelligence, and her unwavering loyalty could melt the chill of this brilliant, complicated man. The first days of their marriage were polite, stilted, and deeply strange. Elisabeth found herself placed in a suite of rooms that felt more like a perfectly decorated display case than a home. Her staff was efficient, her meals were magnificent, but the man she had promised her life to was constantly absent. He was either in the library, the barracks, or the music room, everywhere but with her. She tried gently. She learned the rhythms of the court, practiced her French, and sought topics that might engage him. One evening, after weeks of strained silence, she gathered her courage. "My lord," she began softly, finding him by a window looking out at the foggy Prussian landscape. "I have been reading the works of Voltaire. They are challenging but insightful. You admire him so much. I wonder if you would guide my understanding of his thoughts on governance." Frederick turned, his gaze sharp enough to cut glass. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a chair. "Madam," he replied, his voice precise and completely devoid of warmth, "your duties are to be a credit to your family and to the stability of the crown. Political philosophy is not a necessary task for you. Leave the governing to those who are capable of it." The words landed like a physical blow. It was a rejection, not just of her offer, but of her mind, her efforts, and her very right to exist near his serious world. It was the first and most important lesson of her life as queen. She was irrelevant. A few years later, the moment Elisabeth had prepared for arrived. Frederick's father died. He became Frederick II, King of Prussia, Frederick the Great. The nation was jubilant. The bells rang out, and the power that had always shimmered around him now settled upon his shoulders like a golden cloak. Elizabeth, standing stiffly at the coronation, felt a surge of loyalty and pride. Now, she thought, his greatness will require a great queen at his side. Now, the loneliness will end. But the crown did not bring them together. It pushed them further apart. Immediately after his ascension, Frederick made his intentions chillingly clear. He established his own court miles away from the capital, in a grand, sun-drenched new palace called Sanssouci. Without a care, this was to be his sanctuary, his place for intellectual debate, music, and the company of the brilliant minds he truly valued. He designated a separate residence for his wife. Not a prison, but a perfectly luxurious palace called Skönhausen, far enough away to ensure that their paths would never, by accident, cross. He had created two royal worlds in his kingdom. His world of genius and action, and hers, the silent, elegant world of a queen who was never meant to be seen. The message was unmistakable. The crown required a queen's title, but the king did not require a queen. Elisabeth Christine had entered her marriage with the promise of a throne. She was now living the chilling reality. She had the throne, but she had lost her life. The silence had begun, and it would last for 40 long, terrible years. She looked at the palace walls, and they no longer seemed to whisper of defeat, but to scream of an invisible existence. The move to Skönhausen Palace was not a banishment spoken aloud. It was simply a fact of the new king's life. Frederick, known for his precision and efficiency in all matters of state and war, applied the same chilling logic to his marriage. He created an official distance that was absolute, professional, and cruel in its very politeness. Elisabeth Christine found herself in a residence of profound opulence. Skönhausen was beautiful, surrounded by exquisite gardens, and managed by a perfectly trained staff, but it felt less like a palace and more like a gilded waiting room. She was always waiting. Waiting for a note, waiting for a visit, waiting for the one sign that her existence still mattered to the king. In the early years of this separation, Elizabeth refused to surrender hope. She saw her role not just as a symbol, but as a potential comfort and strength to the great man who bore the burdens of a nation. She knew of his intense anxieties, his quick temper, and the immense pressure he placed upon himself. She genuinely wished to be the one safe harbor where the great king could simply be Frederick. She began a quiet campaign of unwavering presence. Whenever Frederick was forced by protocol or state business to be in Berlin, Elizabeth ensured she was there too, ready to host, ready to observe, always perfectly dressed and impeccably mannered. She wrote him letters, not demanding or pleading, but cheerful, supportive notes discussing news of the court, local events, or simply wishing him good health. She sent him small, thoughtful gifts, fine tobacco, freshly roasted coffee beans, or musical scores she thought he might enjoy. Her actions were a constant declaration of loyalty, a silent promise that she would be his queen, even if he refused to be her king. Frederick's response was a masterpiece of emotional neglect. He rarely wrote back, and when he did, the letters were brief, formal, and signed with a cold, almost businesslike flourish. The gifts were acknowledged by a secretary, if at all. When they met at state functions, he treated her with impeccable public courtesy. A polite nod, a brief, impersonal question about her health, before turning immediately to address a general, a diplomat, or a visiting musician. It was during one such state dinner that the full, agonizing reality of her isolation hit Elizabeth. The dining hall was ablaze with candlelight and laughter. Frederick was at the center of a magnetic circle of men, philosophers, composers, and brilliant military minds. They spoke French, the language of the enlightened court, discussing everything from the movement of the stars to the strategy for the next war. Frederick was animated, witty, his eyes sparkling with genuine pleasure. This was the man she had hoped to know, the soul she yearned to share. Elisabeth was seated at a secondary table, fulfilling her duty as hostess, engaging in polite, trivial conversation with elderly diplomats and their wives. She watched her husband's joy from across the room, realizing with a sick lurch that his truest, deepest life was happening over there. And she was excluded not by distance, but by choice. She was physically present, a glittering accessory to the crown, but emotionally and intellectually, she was on another continent. That night, she went back to her beautiful, empty rooms at Skanhausen, and the silence seemed to press in on her like a physical weight. She was not just lonely, she was unacknowledged. The celebrated king, who prided himself on recognizing and rewarding talent, refused to recognize the one person who offered him unconditional love and allegiance. This systematic and prolonged emotional distance caused Elisabeth to change. The initial hope gave way to a deep, profound resignation. She realized that her loyalty was not a key to unlock his heart, but merely a comfort she offered herself. If he wouldn't accept her, she would not fall apart. She would turn inward and build a quiet, internal strength. She dedicated herself to her duties that remained: charity, careful management of her estates, and maintaining a court that, while small, was known for its kindness and grace. The world outside the palace gates knew Frederick the Great for his campaigns and his philosophy, but the small circle of people who knew Elisabeth Christine knew her for her unwavering goodness. But still, the fundamental pain remained. The king had carved out two separate kingdoms, one for glory and one for his forgotten wife, and the border between them was an emotional wall thicker and colder than any stone fort. The decades stretched ahead of her, a vast, echoing landscape of public duty and private, crushing loneliness. Frederick the Great's most famous creation, the Palace of Sanssouci, was the physical manifestation of Elisabeth Christine's total exclusion. Its name, meaning without a care, was a cruel irony for the queen, who spent every day worrying about her husband's health, safety, and ultimate distance. Sanssouci was not built for a royal family. It was built for a king and his chosen companions. Perched high on a terraced vineyard overlooking Potsdam, the small, elegant palace was designed as an intimate refuge from the harsh realities of governance and war. It was a haven dedicated to art, music, philosophical debate, and quiet pleasure. It was, in every brick and every statue, a place where Elisabeth Christine was expressly not welcome. Frederick filled Sanssouci with those he truly valued. Here, he welcomed the great French philosopher Voltaire, who was the star of the king's intellectual circle. They would spend hours discussing metaphysics, poetry, and politics, completely absorbed in a world where ideas were more real than human emotion. The king's personal musicians and composers were always present, providing the soundtrack to his intellectual life. For Elisabeth, her husband's social circle was another source of profound pain. She did not envy the king's love for philosophy or music. She envied the connection. Frederick, the brilliant leader who was emotionally frozen toward his own wife, formed deep, intense friendships with other people. He was capable of loyalty, warmth, and even affectionate humor, but only for those he chose, those who could meet him on his own lofty intellectual battlefield. Elisabeth, forced to remain at Skanhausen, miles away, could only hear echoes of this vibrant, joyful life. She was the queen, Yet she was an outsider looking in on her own husband's home. She became acutely aware that Frederick had two lives: the political life he shared with his generals and diplomats, and the personal life he shared with his circle of male confidants. She was a silent spectator to both. The king's physical proximity to her was regulated with the precision of a military campaign. When Frederick was forced to return to the capital, Berlin, for ceremonial reasons, Elizabeth would also move, following protocol exactly. However, these meetings were rare, always public, and always brief. One particularly harsh custom solidified her status as the ghost of Sanssouci. If Elizabeth wished to send the king a note, a request, or even a personal wish, she had to address it through the king's secretary, or sometimes through her own brother, Prince Ferdinand, who served in the king's army. She could not approach him directly. It was a humiliating system that stripped her of all wifely intimacy, reducing her communication to official channels, as if she were a minor foreign dignitary. As the years blurred, 10 years, then 20, Elizabeth's internal battle shifted. She stopped actively trying to win his affection. She began to focus on maintaining her own dignity and mental health in the face of such continuous neglect. She turned to her deep religious faith and to her duties as a source of strength. She took on the task of helping the poor, supporting charitable institutions, and discreetly encouraging the arts in her own small court. She created a refuge of kindness at Schönhausen, where those who felt overwhelmed by the cold formality of Frederick's official court found a gentle, humane center. She became known as the Good Queen Elizabeth, a title that spoke volumes, not only of her virtue but also of her practical separation from her husband's life. In this self-imposed, quiet life, she found a strange kind of peace. She recognized that the man she had married, the brilliant, terrifying king, was never going to be the husband she hoped for. She had to mourn the life she wished for and choose to live the life she had been given, with grace. But the pain of invisibility never fully faded. To be the loyal, steadfast wife of a celebrated genius, only to be utterly unacknowledged by him, was a continuous wound. Frederick the Great's greatness was written in history books. Elisabeth Christine's enduring loyalty was written only on her own lonely heart. She existed in the dazzling shadow of his fame, the silent queen of a kingdom that her own husband had split in two. The long, quiet decades of Elisabeth Christine's life at Schönhausen were shattered in 1756 by the eruption of the 7 Years' War. This brutal conflict pitted Frederick the Great and Prussia against a massive coalition of European powers, including Austria, France, and Russia. It was a time of immense danger, and it proved to be the furnace in which Elizabeth's unwavering loyalty was truly forged. Suddenly, the cold distance between the king and queen was irrelevant. The fate of the entire kingdom was at stake. Frederick, risking everything, was constantly on the battlefield. He faced overwhelming odds, suffering crushing defeats one moment, only to pull off miraculous victories the next. The constant tension of the war meant that the king was often in deep personal danger, sometimes seemingly on the verge of total collapse or capture. For Elizabeth, these years were agonizing. She was confined to the capital, forced to wait and worry, receiving news of her husband only through official couriers and often delayed, contradictory reports. Despite his chilling neglect, he was still her husband, the crown she served, and the cornerstone of her entire existence. Her prayers for his safety were constant and fervent. During the most difficult years of the war, the enemy forces, particularly the Russians and Austrians, managed to penetrate deep into Prussia. In 1757, and even more terrifyingly in 1760, enemy troops entered Berlin. The capital, and Elizabeth's palace were directly threatened. In 1760, as the Russian army approached, the situation became dire. Elizabeth, demonstrating a courage her husband would never acknowledge, calmly packed what she could and prepared for evacuation. She did not panic. She ensured the security of the court archives and maintained a quiet dignity, refusing to flee until the danger was absolute and immediate. With cannon fire audible in the distance, she was forced to abandon Skanhausen and retreat to Magdeburg, a safer fortress city. This forced flight was immensely stressful, but throughout the entire ordeal, Elizabeth maintained her composure, embodying the steady, stable face of the Prussian monarchy while the king was fighting for its very existence in the field. She became a symbol of resilience for the frightened civilian population and the remaining government officials. While in Magdeburg, isolated and terrified for her nation, she continued her primary mission, to be the queen. She corresponded tirelessly with ministers, offering encouragement and assistance wherever she could. She used her personal funds to support wounded soldiers and the families left destitute by the fighting. Her focus was never on her own safety or comfort, but on the survival of Frederick's kingdom. What was most remarkable was her communication with Frederick himself. She never used the war as an opportunity to complain about her loneliness or demand attention. Instead, her letters were filled with carefully controlled, highly practical information about the mood in the capital, the stability of the finances, and gentle words of encouragement. She was the one consistent, reliable presence back home. However, even in this shared national crisis, Frederick's distance remained absolute. He appreciated the stability she provided, but only in the professional sense of a reliable administrator. There was no softening of his emotional armor, no recognition of her bravery, and certainly no gratitude that acknowledged her as a true partner. When the war finally ended in 1763, Frederick returned to a battered but victorious Prussia, lauded as a military genius. His return was celebrated, but Elisabeth Christine was not by his side in the grand parade. She was informed of his movements and allowed to join him for brief, formal reunion ceremonies, but only in Berlin, never at his beloved Sanssouci. She had endured the threat of invasion, the terror of exile, and the crushing anxiety of his potential death, all while flawlessly fulfilling the duties he had imposed upon her. Yet, the victory did not bring her closer to her husband. It simply returned her to the original, cold routine. The king was safe and the queen was forgotten. The 7 Years' War proved Elisabeth Christine's mettle. She was, in every sense, a loyal queen who served her country with bravery and dignity. But to Frederick the Great, she remained only a necessary fixture of the state, not the cherished partner who had weathered the storm with him. The victory was his alone, and her quiet sacrifices were left unacknowledged in the shadow of his fame. After the 7 Years' War, the boundaries of Elisabeth Christine's life solidified into a routine of public duty and private solitude. The expectation of becoming a true partner to Frederick had long evaporated, replaced by the grim knowledge that she was doomed to remain the background figure in his dazzling life. The king, now more celebrated than ever, settled back into his pattern at Sanssouci, only summoning the queen for the few annual state ceremonies, New Year's Day, the king's birthday, and occasionally a wedding. These meetings were legendary in their brevity and formality. They were rituals performed for the court, not moments of intimacy. Frederick would often greet her, speak a few polite sentences about the weather or her journey, and then effectively ignore her for the rest of the event. To cope with this profound and continuous emotional desertion, Elizabeth began cultivating a rich internal life and an external life of quiet, meaningful purpose. She knew she could not command her husband's attention, so she commanded her own world. Her small court at Skanhausen became a haven of culture and gentle society. Unlike Frederick's demanding, hyper-intellectual circle at Sanssouci, Elizabeth's circle was characterized by kindness, compassion, and artistic appreciation. She supported German writers and poets, subtly pushing back against Frederick's preference for all things French. She commissioned art, listened to music, and enjoyed the company of respectable, intelligent women and men who appreciated her sincerity. In this parallel court, she was not the forgotten wife, but the central, respected figure, a queen in every meaningful sense. Her greatest source of comfort and true fulfillment, however, lay in her charitable work. Elizabeth dedicated herself to helping the poor, the sick, and especially the forgotten women of Prussia. She established institutions for the education of girls and provided financial support for widows. She funded hospitals and secretly helped families who had fallen out of favor with the cold, unforgiving political machine run by her husband. This charity was more than just good works. It was a quiet form of rebellion. Frederick the Great was an efficient ruler, but often a harsh and unfeeling one, prioritizing the state's coffers and military strength over the welfare of individuals. Elizabeth's kindness served as the moral counterpoint to his cold efficiency. By providing comfort and humanity, she demonstrated that the heart of the monarchy, though hidden away, was still beating warmly. She found her self-worth not in her relationship with her husband, but in her relationship with her people. She never used her position to criticize Frederick or interfere directly with state policy. Her loyalty, though unrewarded, remained absolute. She simply chose to build her kingdom on compassion, while his was built on steel. As the years advanced and her hair grayed, she settled into a deeply religious routine. Her faith provided the philosophical framework she needed to endure her solitude, believing that her suffering was part of a larger, divine plan. The Queen, who had lived her entire adult life in the public eye, yet remained profoundly private, learned the value of inner resilience. Elisabeth Christine was the living example that loneliness does not have to equal emptiness. She transformed her emotional absence into a spiritual and moral presence. While her husband traveled the world, waging wars and charming philosophers, she rooted herself deeply in the soil of her country, providing unseen nurture and stability. She became a symbol of quiet endurance, a figure of strength defined by what she gave, not by what she received. For 40 years, the great king had left her unacknowledged, yet in her invisibility, Elisabeth Christine managed to carve out a legacy of unwavering human goodness that even Frederick the Great's overwhelming shadow could not entirely obscure. As the decades turned into 40 years, Frederick the Great and Elisabeth Christine had achieved a rare, tragic form of stability. Their marriage was not one of love, hatred, or even indifference, but one of absolute, formalized distance. It was an arrangement that worked for the king, who had secured a loyal consort without compromising his bachelor lifestyle at Sanssouci, and one that Elizabeth had learned to survive with grace and dignity. The king, now aging and often suffering from poor health and the strains of his long reign, became increasingly withdrawn. His famous intellectual circle began to thin out as friends and philosophers died. His later years were marked by deep solitude, though a self-chosen one, spent largely with his beloved dogs, his flute, and his manuscripts at his palace. During these final years, the protocol that dictated the Queen's separation remained rigidly in place. It was a rule so powerful that even sickness or national holidays could barely bend it. Elizabeth lived in a constant state of alert, ready to travel to Berlin the moment she was commanded, and ready to return to Skanhausen the moment the ceremony was over. There were moments, rare and poignant, when the shield of protocol seemed to falter, offering a tiny glimpse of the human tragedy beneath the crown. One famous anecdote illustrates the absolute nature of their estrangement. After years of the deepest separation, Frederick was attending a state function in Berlin. He encountered Elisabeth, and in a momentary lapse of memory, or perhaps a brief, confused flicker of recognition, he reportedly leaned toward a courtier and asked, "Who is that lady?" The courtier, aghast, had to whisper, "Sire, that is your queen." While the truth of this story is debated by historians, the fact that it was told and believed by the court highlights the depth of Elizabeth's invisibility. The king, celebrated for remembering every detail of his armies and his philosophical arguments, could not recognize the face of the woman he had been married to for half a century. Elizabeth, for her part, maintained her perfect loyalty until the end. She was often deeply distressed by reports of Frederick's declining health and increasing bitterness. She never demanded to see him, knowing that such a demand would only be met with sharp rejection. She relied on the detailed, though sterile, reports from his doctor and staff. In their very last years, the king did send a few small, cold gestures of acknowledgement. He occasionally sent her rare fruits from his greenhouses or requested a piece of fine lace she was known to make. These were not tokens of affection, but rather the actions of a precise ruler recognizing a functional relationship. They were received by Elizabeth with quiet gratitude, as any small crumb of attention was precious. Her final, most public act of loyalty came when Frederick lay dying in 1786 at Sanssouci. He was surrounded by his generals and servants, but he strictly forbade any woman, especially his wife, from entering the palace grounds. Elizabeth was forced to wait miles away at Skanhausen, receiving constant updates, unable to offer the simple comfort of her presence to the man she had faithfully served for 53 years. Frederick the Great died as he lived, alone by choice. When the news reached Elizabeth, she grieved not just for the king, but for the life they never had. The king's death finally ended the separation, but it brought no resolution to the pain. Elisabeth Christine's 40 years of quiet suffering were over. She had walked through the most brilliant court in Europe and managed to remain a loyal queen, though an invisible woman. Her endurance, loyalty, and quiet compassion were a testament to a strength that overshadowed the cold genius of her famous husband. Her story is the quiet, tragic proof that sometimes the greatest weight is carried not on the battlefield, but in the silence of an empty room. With Frederick the Great's death, the political and emotional landscape of Prussia shifted instantly. Elisabeth Christine, the queen who had lived in the perpetual twilight of her husband's shadow, finally stepped into the full light of her own significance. She was no longer defined by his neglect, but by her own unshakable character. Her period of profound loneliness and public invisibility was over. She became the Dowager Queen, and her status, always technically high but practically low, now translated into genuine respect and influence. The new king, Frederick William II, Frederick's nephew, held Elizabeth in high esteem, recognizing the deep stability and grace she had brought to the monarchy during the turbulent decades of her marriage. Elizabeth moved from the distant Skanhausen back to the heart of the capital, Berlin. She took up residence in the Berlin City Palace, the main royal residence, finally occupying the central position she had been denied for half a century. Her court, known for its kindness and humanity, immediately became a place of warmth and comfort, a striking contrast to the cold, philosophical rigor of the previous king's regime. The recognition that had been denied her by her husband was now freely given by the people and the new court. She was revered as a symbol of unwavering loyalty and uncomplaining endurance. People remembered her steady hand during the wars and her constant, quiet charity. The moniker, the Good Queen Elizabeth, was used not as a whispered contrast to her husband, but as a genuine tribute to her reign of compassion. Her final years, though relatively short, were marked by a sense of liberation and gentle peace. She was now free to fully pursue her intellectual and charitable interests without the fear of her husband's critical judgment. She dedicated her remaining time to literature, supporting the German language, and expanding her network of charitable foundations. She became a patron and a powerful figure of influence, demonstrating that a queen's power could be wielded through moral authority and kindness, not just military might. She had endured her marriage by believing in a higher purpose beyond Frederick's personal recognition. When she finally died in 1797, 11 years after Frederick, she was mourned not just as the former queen, but as a beloved mother figure of the nation. In the end, Elisabeth Christine achieved a victory that Frederick the Great, with all his military campaigns and intellectual brilliance, could never fully grasp: the victory of the human spirit over abandonment. Frederick was celebrated in history books for his conquests and his mind. Elizabeth was remembered in the hearts of her people for her enduring soul. Her legacy serves as a powerful reminder. Even when living in the shadow of overwhelming genius, one's true value is not determined by the love or acknowledgement of a powerful person, but by the unwavering commitment to one's own goodness. She was the forgotten wife for 40 years, but in her final years, she became the unforgettable queen. She proved that profound loneliness, endured with grace, can become a source of immeasurable strength, finally securing her own true and powerful place in history.